So the Vampire Lord has been out for a day now, and there's already plenty of content of people building him, leveling him up in an absurd amount of time, and then trying to figure out team compositions that work well with him. And there's a lot of content of just watching other people play with it. God damn it, what gets passed off as content is just completely pathetic in 2019 if you ask me. That's a different story. I decided to go for a little bit more of an educational route. I haven't recorded a video like that in ages, and I do feel like the Vampire Lord is probably a really good excuse for me to come back to doing that. It feels like Comtius is trying really hard to reduce the gap between early game players and mid game players, maybe even to end game. They usually always do that in front of their huge updates, just to kind of make people be able to actually participate in new updates. I do think that the Vampire Lord fits into pretty much all of the 3 farming team compositions of Cairos dungeons. So what I'm gonna do in today's video is I'm actually not going to change any of his rune builds, but I'm going to build teams around him and kind of show you guys how you can utilize the Vampire Lord in pretty much every stage of the game and also in every one of the 3 main dungeons. Before we get into the dungeon portion of this video, I do quickly want to take my time and discuss the Vampire Lord's base stats and just his ability kit in general to get the gist of how you want to utilize him, which sort of role he fulfills in your team composition. And if you look at his base stats, I think they're rather average at best. Like his base speed is just slightly below average. His attack on the other hand is pretty comparable to most attackers in the game. Like if you compare him to, let's say, my Lagma run, for instance, they have very similar attack on that regard, very similar defense stats. He actually has a little bit more defense, not sure if you actually want to utilize that. If you look at his abilities, it's very similar to how vampires in general are played. The first skill is just a very generic lifesteal for himself, while the second skill on the other hand pretty much packs all of the utility of the 2 of their skills in just one. That's a 3-time multi-hit that also applies attack decrease, it applies attack speed slow, and beneficial block. It actually goes up to 100% if you fully skill him, which I myself, I only had 6 vampires saved up, so I'm probably gonna have to do a little bit more fusing for the rest of the week. But I think for today's guide video, this should do the job just fine. I think the bottom line is gonna be that he is one of those units that does require skill ups. Like his first skill is definitely not the reason why you want to utilize him, but once you got him fully skilled, he's like an insane support. And in addition to that, his third skill, that unit actually introduces a new mechanic in the form of an additional buff, which grants some additional lifesteal to your entire team composition. So it's sort of like a vampire effect for your entire team. And on top of that, he's giving you attack buff and also has a dungeon leader skill, which is 38% attack power, which is pretty insane. That's as close to the Perna leader skill as it can get. When it comes to the rune set, he actually comes with a rune set once you summon him, which is just insane. And for all of the early game / mid game players, I think you want to stick with that rune set for the majority of the game. I think just for this video, I'm gonna make a point of not swapping out any sort of runes. I did actually, unfortunately, grind a couple of his runes a little bit, but I think this is probably not going to have such a huge impact on the results of this testing anyways. The bottom line is, if you're an early game player or a mid game player, I would really not recommend swapping out any of the runes that he has on, especially since once you swap them off, they're actually going to get deleted. So even if you have upgrades that could potentially work very well for him, I think, and I would recommend just giving those to other units that work in his team composition, because you're going to get a lot more bang for buck like that. But now with the basics out of the way, let's get into the actual testing, shall we? So I think the first dungeon that I want to discuss is going to be Giant Speed 10. So for Giant Speed 10, I segmented it into 3 different types of team compositions that you can run. The first one is pretty much like the full free-to-play team composition that you see in the background right now, that every beginner should be starting to build. I mean, the one that I'm running right now is more on the damage heavy spectrum. I think if you want to swap out something, or if I want to mention something right away, I don't really think that you need to run an Eirgar and a Sigmarus in combination. I think it's either one of those 2 for most beginners. I myself, I love using Eirgar. She really helped me out get that 100% success rate in my first Giants teams, and also she's just way easier to fuse than a Sig, but I do know that Sig scales much better into mid game once you get into let's say TOA hardware. That HP scaling does come in very handy. So if there's one thing, if you have issues with, let's say, the success rate of that team composition, you might want to consider swapping in something like a Burnout or an additional defense buff. The issue with the Vampire Lord is that he sort of functions as a healer, but he only really does a lot of healing when you run damage dealers with him. So if you're like a beginner and you want to run like a very safe team compositions, chances are you're not going to run a lot of damage dealers, and if you do, most likely they're just going to get one shot by the actual boss. So because of that reason, I would definitely recommend still running some sort of healing. Right now I'm running Lulu. I think she's basically one of the best cleansers slash healers that you can find right now in the game, especially since like Beladion kind of got devalued a little bit for now. I mean, we all aren't really 100% certain what the new secondary evolutions are going to look like. They might actually get Beladion like a next revamp and make him like really viable nowadays. For now, I'm actually sticking with my Cowgirl in combination with Lulu over, let's say, Beladion with a Veramos. I do also want to mention that the Cowgirl isn't even 6-starred, and I don't even have full rune sets on some of these monsters. You can definitely replicate the success rate of this team composition with much worse runes than I have right now. I just kind of realized that once I was building speed teams that some of those monsters weren't even like fully runed, but as you guys can see, it's still working out just fine. I mean, as an endgame player, you're probably not going to be building giant speed 10 slow teams anyway, so whatever. The next team compositions that I want to discuss are going to be giant speed 10 semi-speed teams. Now the definition of that is basically building a regular like slow team that's safe and just trying to increase the speed of it by adding some additional AoE nukers while still keeping the success rate. The main way to do that is basically by getting some additional attack bar manipulation in there. I think the Cowgirl, same as let's say a Hua for instance, should do the job just fine. I think Hua is a little bit outdated in 2019. I think the Cowgirl is basically like an updated version to her with basically a better leader skill, more usability in PvP. The only reason why she's sort of weaker is probably going to be R5, but outside of that, I think the Cowgirl, especially for beginners, is going to be much better. Also, if you consider the fact that she has a strip, which is going to come in very handy once you reach the boss fight. But basically what you're trying to do is adding some additional AoE effects. Now with the Vampire not providing AoE defense break like a Galleon, I think those two units are pretty much on par when it comes to the way you want to utilize them and sort of the synergy that they want to provide, whereas Galleon, he always used to be sort of okayish with Illusion. They didn't really synergize too well together since the time to loot did basically way too much for Illusion to function. The main issue with Illusion team compositions in speed teams was just that there were no actually suitable alternatives. Megan was just way too tanky and slow. Similar for, let's say, a Fran, and all of the other ones. A Chisun is just way too tanky, and a Huahi, for instance, really doesn't suit that position either. So as you guys can see, you're very limited if you want to utilize Illusion, whereas I think the Vampire Lord fits that sort of playstyle very well. So I think the bottom line is going to be, if you have Illusion, I would recommend building the Vampire Lord to work with him, or if you have a Galleon, I wouldn't really recommend using those two units together. You're kind of just overlapping usability. You're using two units that have very similar positions in a team composition, and you have to try really hard to actually make up for that. So I wouldn't really recommend that. But I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about a semi-speed team. You can pretty much make a lot of things work, but this is probably going to be the most efficient way to run him without swapping out a lot of units. And now let's get into the third portion of this video with Giant Speed 10 speed teams. Now I already talked about how I think the Vampire Lord and Galleon don't really synergize too well, but you do need some sort of AoE armor break to actually deal with this dungeon, which is also the reason why I don't really think that he's going to be very good for Giant Speed 10 speed teams. I already mentioned it at the start that I think this unit in particular is sort of meant by Comtius to narrow down the gap between early and mid game players, and this is like one of the reasons why I think that way. Like, he doesn't really bring much to the table when it comes to actual speed teams, whereas he provides a lot more utility where you make certain team compositions a lot more viable just by adding one specific monster. So as you guys can see right now, even though I'm actually getting pretty good times, it's not really because of the Vampire Lord, but just because of the synergy that Galleon and Lucian have, where the Vampire Lord really doesn't come in too handy. But if you do not have a Galleon, I do think that the Vampire Lord works very well with two Lucians on its own, and pretty much what I would recommend when it comes to armor break is just running something like a Dark Harpy, and I do think that you're gonna get below 1 minute runs rather easy like that. Just to give you guys my too long didn't read version on Giant Speed 10, I think the Vampire Lord works very well for beginner team compositions and also sort of semi-speed team compositions. He doesn't fit into every team in those, but he does open up a lot of different varieties abilities, but once you get into speed teams, I do think that there are much better options out there. Like the Giant Speed 10 speed meter is like super clutch, and most monsters work much better with a Galleon than with a Vampire Lord. So if I had to give the Vampire Lord a ranking, I would probably give him like a 6 out of 10 for Giant Speed 10, but with like an additional 9 out of 10 for beginners. Now with Giant Speed 10 done, let's talk about Dragon Speed 10. Again, we're going to start off by talking about Dragon Speed 10 slow team composition. So those are going to be like the completely safe ones that are basically just meant for you to clear the dungeon. You don't really care about how long it's going to take. Right now, as you guys can see, I'm running something like a Buttaha, which now is actually a free-to-play monster. I never thought to see the day where I said that, actually. I'm running a Belladion with a Lulu, and to be honest, not to spoil you guys too much, I really don't like the Vampire Lord in those sort of team compositions. He scales very, very well once you reach the point where you actually start utilizing damage dealers in your team comps. And the way Dragon Speed 10 speed team compositions work normally, you don't really run a lot of damage in those anyways, which makes him rather lackluster in that regard. You're gonna see it at the end of this run in particular. Once the boss reaches below 30% HP, he's just gonna one-shot my Vampire Lord, especially with that damage build that he's on with the initial rune sets. And I do really not think that he's going to be very useful for beginner Dragon Speed 10 teams. But once you move into Dragon Speed 10 semi-speed teams, again, that's pretty much the point where you start including damage dealers, but still try and have some sort of tankability in there by either using some healers or some additional cleanse. Right now in my team comp, I'm actually not using any strippers, which is definitely an issue. I think if you want to run a semi-speed team, I would much rather recommend something like a Ludo instead, where you have some healing, maybe a Megan or something like that, which doesn't really synergize very well with the Vampire Lord. So you kind of already get the gist of it. Like, the Vampire Lord is really hard to incorporate in certain team comps. But again, what you see me do right now is substitute Galleon for my Vampire Lord. I think he synergizes rather well with twins, whereas with twins, if you use a Shaina and a Galleon, you're again pretty much using two monsters that have very similar positions and usabilities, and you're kind of overlapping, which is definitely going to reduce the efficiency of your team comp. The way I would recommend it is have him move first, give your entire team composition attack buff, and then have Shaina one-shot everyone with her AoE and just kind of go from there. I think with Dragon Speed 10 it's like really hard to build semi-speed teams, since the boss has like a lot of one-shot mechanics where you either just one-shot the boss or you get one-shot yourself if you run a lot of squishy units in your team comp. It got a little bit easier with the addition of units like the twins and like Lulu, for instance, but it's still rather hard, and I also didn't really have much success utilizing the Vampire Lord in those sort of comps. So pretty much the way Dragon Speed 10 speed teams are built is either running a Galleon and two water twins, or you run triple twin / Shaina. And to make up for the lack of attack buff, what people usually do is just run a Kali instead, for instance, where I do think Kali is like pretty hard to rune, first of all, because you want her to hit hard, you want her to crit all of the time, and then you gotta move first, which, yeah, that's a lot of stats that you want to put in there. And I think the Vampire, again, is one of those units where it's pretty much just a walking attack buff with some additional sustain that you can get for your entire team comp. So like Giant Speed 10, which we earlier discussed already, it just is one of those units that opens you up to a lot more different variety in your comp and just kind of helps you optimize your rune distribution by not having to put like extremely strong rune sets on monsters that you use in like one or two situations, which I think is a really good thing. So in general, I would give the Vampire Lord for Dragon Speed 10 like a 2 out of 10 for beginner teams, 3 out of 10 for intermediate teams, which I would just not recommend building at all. And once you get into those speed teams, which is really easy to get to at this point, like you build either Tark teams, which are rather hard to rune, but if you don't have any twins, just go for those. Or you build a team with twins if you don't have a Galleon. So like speed teams, I haven't tested it too much, but so far I'm getting like a little bit above average times using him alongside with twins. So I would probably give him like an 8 out of 10 or something like that. And now let's get into the third portion of this video, talking about Necro. Now, I don't really think that for beginners it's important to get into Necro. There are basically two options that you got. It's either going to be, do you have twins? If that's going to be the case, I think you can sort of get away with trying to build Necro teams rather early, and I do think that he fits into those sort of team compositions rather well. As an off healer that also provides attack speed slow, which, for instance, if you pack your team full with twins, you most likely are not going to have that sort of debuff in your comp, and because of that reason alone, it's sort of already pretty okay-ish. Which sort of healers would I recommend running with it? I myself, like so far I've tested it even without a healer. If for that to actually work, you gotta make sure that first of all he needs to be on Violet runes, and second of all he probably needs to be the fastest one in your comp. But keep in mind, if your squishy nukers hit the boss when he is still in his shield form, they're not going to heal back for anything, and because of that reason it's really inconsistent, and because of that reason I would really not recommend, especially for early game players, using him as your only healer. Oh yeah, and the second option is, again, if you don't have any twins, I don't think that farming Necro in that case is such a viable option for you to go about. You can still build like a really fast Giants team, go into a raid instead. There are certain alternatives, I discussed that in plenty of my videos so far, such as going for a Lich team, all of those things, but those team compositions first of all require a lot better stats and also fully skilled units, which most of the time you're not going to have that. So the Vampire Lord in Necro B10 speed teams is really weird to use. I personally so far have tested him in a couple of those, again combining him with twins, combining him with Lucians and all of that thing. The main issue that you're gonna have with lifesteal, and that's also the reason why I shied away from running something like a Vampire Lucian, is just gonna be the fact that when you hit the boss, when he's still on his shield, you're not going to heal back for anything, which makes the fight extremely inconsistent. Keep in mind that for Necro in particular, there are just a handful of units that don't require skill ups, and since I personally don't have my Vampire Lord skilled up right now, like especially his second skill gives you a lot of different utility, and I don't have it fully skilled, I don't have the cooldown reduction on it, I don't even get the 100% activation rate, and just because of that reason, I'm not 100% certain how I should feel about my results on that topic. I think he's at least above average, if not on par with units like Fran, which you should probably already have built at this point anyways. But if I have to compare him to Fran, I think he's a little bit below average. So again, as a main healer, probably not going to work out. So it basically just boils down to, for speed teams, you're most likely either going to run no healers or just one, where Fran is just straight up better. And for like intermediate teams, I think he's a pretty good addition to your comp, especially since you're getting him for free and already runed up, even though those rune sets don't really work out too well for Necro in particular. So now let's move over to my final verdict on that unit. In general, I did kind of expect those results. Computers never really releases units that are just completely insane for endgame, unless they're like hard to get, such as like Homunculus, where people have to farm for like 2 weeks or so to actually get it. But I do think that the Vampire Lord does have a place in the meta, especially when you want to catch up to endgame players. It's definitely one of those ways to make up for not having certain units in your comps. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to record today's video. I mean, it's basically just me telling you guys to run twins or something like that. But this game is all about efficiency, and I would feel bad if I were to recommend certain team comps that actually aren't really that great in the first place. So maybe this video helped out 1 or 2 of you guys that are thinking about, for let's say, building the Vampire just to improve their Dragon Speed 10 team or things like that, which I hope I cleared those questions up in that video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like, and until then, see you guys in the next one. Bye!